according to St. Luke. And this is a long one, so it's okay if you need to sit. Then the assembly rose as a body and brought Jesus before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king." Then Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered, "You say so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no basis for an accusation against this man." But they were insistent and said, "He stirs up the people by teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee where he began, even to this place." When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him off to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had been wanting to see him for a long time, because he had heard about him, and was hoping to see him perform some sign. He questioned him at some length, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by him, vehemently accusing him. Even Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then he put an elegant robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. That same day, Herod and Pilate became friends with each other. Before they had been enemies. Pilate then called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who is perverting the people. And here I have examined him in your presence and have not found this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. Indeed, he has done nothing deserving death. I will therefore have him flogged and release him." Then they all shouted together, "Away with this fellow! Release Barabbas for us!" This was a man who had been put in prison for an insurrection that had taken place in the city and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again. But they kept shouting, "Crucify! Crucify him!" A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no ground for the sentence of death. I will therefore have him flogged and then release him." But they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate gave his verdict, that their demand should be granted. He released the man they asked for, the one who had been put in prison for insurrection and murder, and he handed Jesus over as they wished. As they led him away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, and they laid the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A great number of the people followed him. Among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are surely coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" Two others also, who were criminals, were led away to be put to death with him. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing, and the people stood by, watching. But the leaders scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong. Then he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. He replied, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, while the sun's light failed and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. Having said this, he breathed his last. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God and said, certainly this man was innocent. And when all the crowds who had gathered there for the spectacle saw what had taken place, they returned home beating their breasts. But all his acquaintances, including the woman who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise you, O Christ.
You may be seated. Dear people of God, it is one thing to love your friends and to do good to those who do good to you. That is, in fact, a common virtue among all people, not just Christians, but pagans also. However, it is a completely different thing to die for your enemies and to do good to those who do evil to you. On the Sunday of the Passion today, this is the kind of God we encounter. The one who loves his enemies, the one who loves those who hate him. In the cross we see the depth of God's love. He didn't have to die on that cross to save people who were already good. None of us are that. He died on that cross to save his enemies. The Psalms are the prayers of Jesus, and in our passage from Psalm 31 that Isabel read, we meet Jesus who is in agony. He prays, my eyes waste away from grief. My strength fails because of my misery. My bones waste away. I am the scorn of all my adversaries, a horror to my neighbors. People flee from me. I hear the whispering of many terror all around as they scheme together against me, as they plot to take my life. We might be tempted to think, if I were there then, I would have done better. I would have rescued Jesus from the cross. Would you now? We have Christ in his word now. How often does that word go neglected and abused, even though God so graciously gives? We have Christ in our neighbor now. How often we choose ourselves over helping our neighbor. No, we are no better than those who put Christ on the cross. The cross is at one and the same time our greatest humiliation and our greatest joy. Humiliation because the cross spells judgment and death to the sin that dwells within us. Joy because the cross unbinds us from the very same sin and death that dwells within us. I think of this passage from Romans. But God proves his love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Much more surely than now that we have been justified by his blood, will we be saved through him from the wrath of God? For if while we were enemies we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, much more surely, having been reconciled, we will be saved by his life. Only God could transform the cross from an instrument of death and torture to an instrument that gives life and salvation. On the cross, God laid down his life so that you may have life. A life teeming with joy that we did not have before, and freedom that we did not have before. As one theologian put it, here is God ripped apart for our sake, for our sin, for our death, for our evil, for the cross we deserve. And so we say that God did not die for the good people, or people who are mostly okay, or people with just a few defects. Christ died for sinners, people who are sinners through and through, his enemies. And for such lowly people, Christ crucified is good news. For God loves you so much that he died for you. You are redeemed of all the sin that has bound you down. And nothing can now separate you from God's love in Jesus Christ. And today in your presence stands your Lord Christ in his word. And he has chosen you. What is done is done. Now that you have been justified by his blood, he is not only your good friend, but your loving brother who takes care of you. And because by his cross you have a living word, you also have this: life, truth, light, peace, righteousness, salvation, joy, freedom, wisdom, power, grace, glory, and every imaginable blessing. All these are yours by grace. Please rise as you are able.